Welcome back. We are here once again. This is Ian McKenzie, and I'm joined by
Zamir Danji.
And we are here to offer a conversation recap on our session. It was last week, actually, this time, with artist, activist, poet Alixa Garcia.
Yeah, it was truly a deep listening experience for me, just to really let the spirit of what she was saying permeate me, I felt. And she had opened with this intention to, just as Pat McCabe did as well. And I noticed this quality actually almost between them, this quality of opening oneself and listening to what wants to be spoken. And so I was just sort of taking that in since she had invoked that. And it was beautiful. It really touched me, our conversation.
For me, this conversation was, I was really curious to, one, get her perspective of being in New York, early days of the pandemic. I thought that was, powerful for her to share. I mean, she had some specific writing that she'd done, and we touched on that as well. But that, really this conversation drew upon her many years. Probably at least 2 decades now, really engaged in this sense of that there's a deep climate emergency, which of course is now really upon us. And that, all of her work and efforts in weaving and wondering as an imaginal curiosity or as an imaginal being, and we touched on that too as the sense of how to approach this time. That this whole pandemic conversation as well was sort of loomed through that wider lens. Again, of what is the Earth speaking, what is it saying to us? What do we need to hear, and how? And that to me was really sort of the not backdrop per se, because it was so much of the conversation, but it's so vital in a sense to provide the wider context to something, for example, like the pandemic, and what forces were already at play and what accelerated, and how is it different and more of the same? How might it be different? The imaginal futures. That to me was like the overall sense of our journey.
Yeah. When she said that word imaginal this time, I immediately thought of those words by Albert Einstein. Imagination is greater than knowledge. And, as we look out, we have so much knowledge in terms of we have all this data of what's going to happen, why things are happening, whether it's the pandemic data, whether it's the climate crisis data, whether it's the health crisis data. I mean, we have all the knowledge, but without imagination, how are we going to create something from a different level of thinking from what created it, which is also what he said. Mm-hmm. So it's like that quality of imagination is so essential. We've placed so much emphasis on, great, we have so much knowledge, we have so much data, but how do we activate the hearts and minds so that we can imagine a different or a possible future, right? Mm-hmm. And there wasn't a tone of great hope in our conversation, though, in many ways. There was, and I'm not even saying it that hope is this wonderful thing that we should celebrate. How do we move in spite of perhaps not having hope, but having clarity? That be tremendous.
I mean, of course, I've been sort of disavowed or messed with in my understanding what hope is through my time with Stephen Jenkinson.
Okay.
And he, a very quick thing is that there's this sense, he learned in the death trade, of course, that there's this often maniacal grip on this sense that hope, like you got to have hope, right? Yeah. And certainly that can be useful when there's, possibilities. But when, for example, a terminal diagnosis is pretty clear in where one is in their time, that this clinging to hope can really make it prevents them. He calls it they die not dying. Right, like they're unable, and this often is collaborated by doctors and family members as well. That they're actually not allowed to die, and then they die not being allowed to die, which sounds again a very it's more than wordplay. But he says, because why does that happen? Well, the opposite of that is understood in that dynamic, in that duality, as well. If you're not hopeful, you're hopeless, right? Which is often akin to despair, and nobody wants to be there because that's just giving up. But he says, there's a third way, which is, is not generally understood as actually a very important way, which he calls being hope-free. Meaning, one doesn't need to be certain about the outcome to be willing to proceed in a meaningful way, right? That and this is the moment, I think, where, particularly when talking about climate emergency, is there's no guarantees, of course, that, quote, it'll work out, because the unraveling of complex systems is very much happening amongst us. And so the kind of adult level sense of consequence and responsibility is to proceed with no hope, right? No guarantee that it'll be. And that seemed to be the quality of Alixa, I think, as well, that she was willing to proceed, particularly to craft beauty, which is a quality that I see so much in her work, both as an artist, like a mural painter and illustrator, but also, of course, with her poetry, which,
right.
She graced us at the beginning of the series, or at the beginning of the conversation, with a beautiful piece, and then again closed us at the end, and it was really profound.
Right. Yeah, I love that poetry that she opened with, and I'm glad we let her do it, because we couldn't have done it, performed in the same way that she did. And I think that set the tone for a lot of how I received the conversation, which is there was an eloquence that matched a deep sense of feeling that she had, as in she was willing to feel deeply the earth, to be a voice for it, and clothe it in her own beautiful language, as she did. But there's this quality of almost an impassionedness in how she spoke, which, I was reading this line from Tyakusin Ghost Horse, who we're going to be interviewing next week. I thought he's just almost like a perfect keynote, like a sort of like a harmonic or an octave above. It's almost like Pat McCabe, and then Alixa, and then Tyakusin. It's almost like a first, a fifth, and then an octave. I kind of think musically. So he had this line, which is, it's not enough for us to do our best. We have to do what's required. And doing what's required, actually, in a way, having hope-free, that's how you see what's required. You get to see what's there and what is. And that's sort of what I heard her say, is like, this is what's required of us. And in relation to the pandemic, one thing that stood out from what she said, which I agreed with, is the absolute necessity to slow down. And that there's been a slowing down, perhaps temporarily, in our capitalist engine, travel engine, by necessity. But she also meant the slowing down of all of us really needing to face ourselves. And that's how we're able to listen to the voice of the earth. How do we really hear nature speaking? So it's touched our hearts. And then we might respond differently. But if we don't slow down, and we have all the gadgets of distractions that have perfectly swept in to help us avoid the discomfort of doing nothing. I was in a hammock yesterday. I committed to doing nothing. It was hard for a little while. We would try to sit and truly do nothing, think nothing, plan nothing, but just be. It's one of the most difficult things for a human being to just simply be with that. And I hear her invitation to that. Then we'll know, we'll hear it ourselves.
I mean, I should name to the audience as well that, this is coming from a fairly experienced meditator. I understand that you are. The difficulty of that very thing, of not, moving on to the next thing constantly, internally. And I'm certainly guilty of that. And, I feel en masse as well with what we're seeing. The deep need, I think, as a theme throughout the whole series, actually has been certainly this quality of listening, of pausing, of understanding, like, where are we, really in relation to all of these forces at work, all of the historical momentum, all of the inability to imagine a kind of post-capitalist future. That, I think it was this conversation where she quoted a different author, I believe, who said, it's easier to imagine the end of humanity or extinction than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Remember that?
Wow.
Right? Which is quite interesting when you think about it, again, because it goes back to another piece of one of our previous conversations where I think I teased apart this idea that humanity and civilization are not inherently the same thing. right? Or maybe civilization even. I believe, like Daniel Pinchbeck, I think as well, maybe has said, well, civilization has some nice things like, good art and this kind of stuff. And I think what I wasn't saying is sort of society, or sort of mass society in some way, like the gathering of people together can create, obviously beautiful creativity and lots of things. But what I think I was more referring to was like modern industrial society that has a particular, obviously kind of voracious, all devouring, that's the Wetiko sort of viral nature, right, of a culture or an anti-culture that devours other cultures.
Well,
Right?
it's so interesting you say that, because that was the story that I told with Shiva, which where the message from Shiva, which is the message of the divine, and you to take it that way, is that, well, consume yourself, use that energy that you have, which is present within humans. We have violence, or we are willing to kill in order to live, and there's some degree of necessity to that. But how do we take that devouring energy and turn it in ourselves? And I think that Alixa is saying, well, we have to face ourselves. We have to see, where is our greed? Where is our anger? Where's our lust? Where's our pride? Where's our attachment and clinging? Where that's that engine that is also within us. We have to be still enough and deeply confront it, so our hearts can say, yeah, this is not the way. In India we say it's not the dharma, which is what, in a way, this creation of Lord Shiva was asking to him, like, what do I do? This hard. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this, to me, I feel like I've also been a sort of jostle with my own contentions, around, in some ways, what feels like a collapse to this idea that change only happens personally, right? That there's this sort of one must change themselves before they change the world, right? That's the dynamic. But that also is deeply co-opted by the very same, capitalist, commodified, personal growth system by which people kind of lull themselves into feeling that they're deeply of sort of revolutionary consequence simply by working on themselves. And it's become now known, of course, that's a never-ending treadmill that also gets eaten up by the very same nature of this larger mass organism. Just as revolutionary movements are the same, they also get devoured by this. Movements that start sort of really oppositional to the all devourer somehow find themselves becoming enveloped, and all of a sudden it's a new brand identity, right, to be revolutionary. Or
exactly.
Right?
Well, that was that I shared that book by Herbert Marcuse, One Dimensional Man. He says that's what happens when you put it in the box of capitalism. It's going to put it in a dimension where it can be sold. It's a pitch. It's a thing, right? It has this wonderful ability to do exactly what you just said, and we can see it in so many arenas. And she mentioned the Zapatistas, and she mentioned some other communities. And one thing that emerged was that you have to design also your thing in such a way where you're in partnership with natural principles. We didn't really go into it, but so that it's not a good host. If you go back to that sort of germ theory versus terrain theory, it's sort of like you have to do the terrain in such a way where the germ's not going to live there like that. Now, that might be idealistic, but
this does get to, I think, the heart of what is really being asked, which is, again, imagining possible futures. And the one future that seems sort of inevitable based on the kind of momentum and the willingness by a lot of people to just continually go along with it is a technocratic society of control. And this is again, like the specter that I think a lot of people are raising the alarm about, the ones that are saying, like, I mean, Charles and others that have said, like, whoa, like, is this actually the future we want, regardless of what one thinks about the efficacy of the vaccines? And it becomes very difficult to imagine other possible futures, right, that essentially allow for the continuation of the system largely as it is, right? Because again, that's the paradox that seems somehow seems unsolvable from within, right? Which is, the question becomes to the dominant culture, how do I keep being exactly as I'm being, but even more so in the future? And the answer seems to be, okay, well, we need more control, we need more treatments, or not treatments, but like sort of dealing with this threat in a way that allows us to continue, I mean, dominant culture as it is. But of course, we're seeing, like Stephen Jenkinson said, again, way back, for life to continue, our way of life has to end. Like that's like a boom, mic drop, like no way around that. And that's not saying necessarily that, humans have to get wiped off the face of the earth, but it means they have to fundamentally restructure how we are in relationship to the earth. And this goes back to, I think, what Alixa was saying around this idea of enchantment, right? Which I thought was such a beautiful rendition she gave. This idea too, I think I wrote out, to return to the song that the wild is singing, that the invitation for dominant culture, which has separated itself so tragically, and therefore from that fundamental tension of being separate, there's a certain wildness, right, which invokes a lot of fear, the need to control. In many ways, one could see the pandemic itself, or the COVID-19, as this wild being that has sort of breached the gates of civilization and is, rampaging among us. Like, and so now again, the fear response of control, lockdowns, right? We have to defeat this beast, so we can go back to being, safe and civilized. And in that sense, it's already too late. Like the beast is among us. And so how do we recognize the invitation, right? The song, because that's the undercurrent of this whole thing.
Yeah. Well, that's quite a counterpoint to, well, we just need to get our next booster shot. And, Pfizer CEO is like, there's another, vaccine that we're going to be able to produce for this. And so there's just such this strong counterpoint between these two. And I think that brings up the challenge that happened in Kelly Brogan's interview, which is around complementarity. And is it possible? Like if one group of people is like, this is the obvious response, and another people like, well, we need to actually deeply listen and connect with the earth and empower a different paradigm of health in our immune systems, have bioregional, communities that are able to govern their response, to be able to have a multi-layered sort of social understanding based on people's preferences and their actual degree of risk to a potential pathogen and what they might choose. I mean, it's like there's like this side here, and these like kind of layers in between. And maybe the thing is that the poles are not meant to meet, and that's why they exist. Like they exist to give a reference point for the other, but what can meet is all the people that are lining and tuning in the layers in between the poles, and that's where we can mix. I don't know if you saw that Heineken ad have you seen that Heineken ad? It's absolutely remarkable, where they have this experiment where they have, a couple of pairs of people. Like one person doesn't believe in climate change at all, right? He's like, if I met someone who's like believed in climate change, it'd be like, you're completely like out to lunch. And there's another guy who's like a climate activist. And then there's one person who doesn't agree with transgender and doesn't think that we're supposed to, and it's completely unnatural. And there's this other woman who is ex-military who then became a woman, and she's transgender, right?
This is
and
a
then
Heineken ad?
It's a Heineken ad. And there was one woman who was a complete like feminist, and another guy who was like total chauvinist. He's like, feminism is actually it's like pulling down our society, like that kind of thing. So these two opposites, they put them in a room together. They don't know each other though. And they have to like figure out how to put a piece of furniture together, and they have to like exchange instructions to help each other out. Then they get to ask each other questions about themselves, sort of like, tell me 5 things about you. And then they're asked to share their degree of similarities and commonalities with each other. And you can see that they actually really like, oh yeah, we have all these commonalities. Like, like I would totally hang out with you, da da da. And then after, they put 2 beers on the table, and this is why it's a Heineken ad. So they have 2 beers there, and then a video shows up, and the video is of each of them speaking about their political, their sexual orientation, their climate views, for each individual person. And they're like, I can't believe that that's the person I'm sitting here with. And then the announcer says, so now you can make a decision. Either you can sit down and have a beer and get to know each other, or you can leave. And each one stops, they sit down, they decide to have a beer with each other. And they're like, you know what, why don't we talk about this? Or like, I'm interested in your view. Like, how would you see it that way? And then another person opens up being like, I've never really talked to someone like this, but I've always felt this way, but maybe I don't see it correctly, right? And it was amazing to just see this experiment and how they were able to come and meet. It's just, if you focus first on your similarities and your basic human connection, then it's a lot easier to meet, right? But we're trained always to see polarization and difference and fear in other who we never talk to, right? And that's decrying. And I'm sure as a media, agent such as yourself, you've probably thought about this a lot.
Well, I mean, that's a remarkable ad. I mean, I'm curious to check it out as well. And also, what I see, I think, was within even the series, right, is the attempt to actually bring together those people that hold a certain perspective, right, of this prism, and being able to invite them in to have these conversations, and for people to listen in and to experience perhaps something similar, right? The ability to hear someone with a little more, through this medium, but to make a connection of a sense like, okay, I see where they're coming from. I see why they might believe what they believe, without immediately resorting to, cancel or polarization, to say I would never, think like them. And so, yeah, I think that's the flavor, the intention certainly has been of this series. And it's been also fascinating to see, right, which side, quote unquote, is willing to, in good faith, hear another side, right? That is not what they believe.
To be fair, I don't think we've represented the pro-vaccine view very thoroughly, and a lot more of the mainstream side. And hopefully we can still maybe find a way to do that. But I think that we have been more towards one direction, in all fairness. Now, we have heard people who've listened to this, and they've come and they've been within a dynamic within their own household where that polarization has existed, but it allowed them to sort of find that common ground. So it's not that it's clearly still serving somewhat of that purpose. So it's curious. Yeah.
And I would say too, though, perhaps in the defense of the roster as well, that though nobody necessarily has been banging the drum of this is absolutely the way in terms of pro-vax, that is the perspective en masse outside of the mainstream culture. I was just reading a New York Times article, opinion piece, where the headline was something like, I'm fed up with the unvaxxed. Like I have zero tolerance for them anymore. They're the reason why this pandemic isn't over. I don't care what they think and why. Like move on, or get out of the way, because you're dragging your feet.
Train's leaving the station, you're on it or you're not, kind of thing.
Yeah. So for me, that's like, that is that is the perspective that so many people are greeted with over and over and over again. And so the nuance here is to be able to, of course, invite perspectives, but in a way that perhaps makes them more accessible. Again, social media is just outrage central, right? Whatever that one disagrees with, if they don't immediately cut it out, right, then it's an outraged remark typically, to dismiss it or to bully them into holding the same perspective, of course. And it's just not the right venue, of course, for nuanced connection, as in the likelihood of connection is just very low, right? It becomes entrenched worldviews sort of dueling it out. And so I feel like with this series as well, I mean, it's good to name, we're heading into our final session, actually. Our final official session next week with, as you mentioned, Tiokasin Ghost Horse, who is a formidable weaver, it seems, of a lot of Indigenous voices and conversations over many years through the radio program that he runs. And I understand also he's a quantum physicist. I think that was what was, or he's deeply studied, at least in quantum physics, as well as the Lakota language as well, and holds a unique perspective that I think brings, particular revelations from
even I was reading in his article that he said that the word domination is not in the Lakota language. And I don't want to give away too much for the next session. I'm sure we'll bring this up, but someone brought this up in our Michael Mead talk. It was a question around, do we need a new language? Or it might have been something similar with bio. Like I'm hearing from people this sort of recognition that there's an imprisonment in language in terms of how we think about these things. From the use of our personal pronouns to words that are in our vocabulary that open our minds to view things in ways that other cultures don't even see that, especially ones that are more collectivistic or are tuned into a more mythic or subtle aspect of life or to the natural world. So it's definitely a question, having someone like Alixa offer poetry is, at least for a lot of us, where our notion of what is true and what we can take in is happening through language, specifically very measured language, very logical and linear and rational language, to take in truth, to take in story, to even hear story or to hear poetry, to help us true to what's happening, right? And that was something that Michael Mead had brought up, right? That if we want to really true, your heart needs to hear a poet or a story to true to what's going on underneath, right? And we are looking to true here. So it's a different kind of truing, and I wonder how, the factual truing and the poetic truing, do the times they're at odds, that sometimes they meet. It's almost, some people might find it hard to hear the poetic truing because the truth that it gives you is different from the one that you had agreed with, that formulated on the factual level. Mm-hmm. Like they can be at deep odds with each other. And I think many people feel that way. There are many very poetic or heartfelt people who are lovers of Earth, who feel that the path in this pandemic is to follow distancing protocols and to wear masks and to trust the science and to get vaccinated. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a deep abiding concern about the Earth or about climate change or any of those things. Like there's just such a complexity in people that, could coexist and be on these lines. It really, it brings us back to that question of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. We have to be willing to be uncertain, even about each other, truly, about what it means.
Thank you for that. I feel perhaps, this also brings us to where we got close to in the end with Alixa, which is around the function of imagination and the ability to imagine. The term imaginal cells was used as I think it relates to the butterfly, and how when the butterfly is or the caterpillar is in the cocoon, it's the imaginal cells that sort of provoke the gooing phase and catalyze the possibility of really a being or a transformation, which to the caterpillar, of course, is completely impossible that would ever be, that could happen. And yet, that latent possibility lies within the being. And so I think that's as a metaphor, as a wondering for this moment, it takes it out of, for me, imagination as a kind of as a kind of gee whiz, must be nice kind of thing, but actually like a radical act. Again, to be able to imagine what futures could be outside of the current paradigm of ever more increasing control and the sort of doubling down, right, of the existing systems. Because it's again, when you try, it's very, very hard to imagine something outside of the current system that you're already in, because again, all of your reference points come from the thing. I mean, this question came up with Stephen Jenkinson around this idea. He's not big on solutions, right? Often that when we say, and I think you did in the interview, like, hey, well, how do we, or what about, and his response to that, and I think I read an extra little interview, or listened to another interview too, where he elaborated further, and I was like, okay, now it makes sense. He said, because so often the jump to solutions comes from, right, the very system or the very water you're swimming in, and the need to like listen, to slow down, to actually create the space whereby a response could come that is not dictated by all of the same mania and
he's describing almost outwardly what mindfulness teaching preaches as well. We operate out of this sort of prefrontal neocortex when we are using our conscious mind, but so often our subconscious mind, our impulses immediately kick in, and we have to intentionally create that space. Otherwise we're just sort of reacting. It's like it's built in, our human brain is like that, so of course we're going to be that way.
This actually, something just landed for me too, I think, in this moment, recognizing that, again, this idea of truing, right, which we've worked with throughout the entire series, and how there's this question too, like, what do we do, or what's meaningful, how to meaningfully respond to this moment. And I think what's coming for me is the recognition, again, maybe it could be mapped as simply, perhaps for the sake of this moment, in this argument, it could be mapped simply that the response of more control and more lockdown and more domination, maybe that could be mapped on the ego understanding, right? The sort of narcissistic, self-centric or human-centric worldview that has been wrapped up within industrial civilization itself, which is, you could almost call it like a macro narcissist, entity, which is why it seems to operate at the expense of any reciprocity, right? With Earth is just simply resources to be managed, within that
You're
world.
thinking more of domination than control. It's a
Well, both are
domination
very,
control, like the
yeah,
domination centric control impulse. Because there's other control that's not necessarily bad, but I'm hearing that domination kind of.
yes, yeah. The need to essentially impose as a
Okay.
response to, fear, wildness, uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so I'm recognizing that, all of the solutions that come from that understanding or that worldview are more of the same, right? We need more control. We need more vaccines. We need more doubling down of these systems. But I'm understanding, I think, right, and a lot of the indigenous guests seem to be saying, which is that's the wrong thing to true to, right? It's not saying don't do them at all, right? Perhaps like maybe it's saying, well, sure, social distancing and things can be useful, and for the particularly vulnerable, vaccines can be useful, but don't true to that as the sort of marching orders of what to do now, but actually use this as a moment to true to the earth long enough so we get that orientation, because the earth is actually telling us what it wants us to do, I think.
And the imagination that's pregnant in crisis, which is now, like, this could be a huge fertile soil for imagination if we really listen deeply to the earth and what it can paint for us in the crisis to come.
That's, yeah. And I guess how I would say it too, I'd recognize, and I feel like I really want to anchor this even in my own sort of like, I need a t-shirt or something, but it's like the sense of the earth knows, I think, how to orient what's needed in this moment. And unless we listen long enough, we'll miss it, right? We'll miss it. And that is an active process of, more than just, simply pausing the machines or, stopping flying for a little bit, but that there's actually like a deep need to return to, in a sense, that sacred encounter, right, is maybe one way I'd say it. And each of us individually can do that as well, I think. I mean, I remember hearing Martin Shaw, the storyteller, early days of the pandemic. He said, for 100 days, he went out to the forest and just offered his calling song, right, to all the beings. I mean, Sophie Strand, I think, as well, was touching in on this, that we ourselves can orient to that source, like the fishes. Michael Meade said, go back to source. That's what the fish did, or the wise fish did. And listen, right? It's like, and listen, it's like, what is it telling you? Because it won't come from the ego mind that is in fear and control, or it needs control. And it won't come from there, but it has to come from somewhere else, and it will come from this connection to life.
Yes. And this is the teaching of the yogis. This is my understanding and teaching of the yogis. That when you experience the deep peace of being with nature, of being with spirit, you realize that so much of our desire and the momentum behind possessing and getting things, it actually disconnects us from that source of peace that we have intrinsically within us, and that we always project outside of ourselves to get it for a second, but then we lose it and we think that we have to go back again to get it for a second, rather than turning in and realizing that the well is here. Take your bucket, dip it down, and drink. I was at a waterfall yesterday. I was just being cleansed by the waterfall and sitting in this beautiful, beautiful place with the plants and with the birds and meditating there. There's such a deep peace that arises. And why do we have to make our life so much about the rat race? It is so important when they do turn in and listen to themselves into nature. You already start to touch that place in you that you can't pretend that you didn't touch it. When these indigenous elders are speaking the voice of the earth because they've had deep contact, they're not saying this like they're trying to get you to miss out on something from the capitalist rostering. Like, they're saying this is so much better and more true and more real. It's an invitation to something that is so much more of the heart and so much more fulfilling. This deep relationship with life, as you speak of. Why would we choose otherwise once we know what's real?
Well, I'd be in the question then too of, because again, lest there be a sort of romanticized sense of like, oh, let's all, disconnect and go meditate. And some do, certainly. But
No,
of
not
course,
as a permanent lifestyle. I mean, like,
yeah, yeah. But I
yeah,
guess
you
what
don't.
I'm trying to say is that, this is the kind of great sort of blind spot of even the mindfulness movement en masse as it's taken up again by the machine again, right? The machine civilization, that it then becomes something to be more mindful about further resource extraction and plunder. So like, I guess I'm saying mindfulness on its own isn't enough. And there's something about needing to confront the systems as they are, but with that sense of mindfulness, right? With that orientation to understand that, without that engagement, it'll come for you anyway, right? Like the system itself is going to constantly eat everything.
It
And
lives
all
inside.
devour.
I mean, you can go sit at the waterfall, and many people do, and they're just going to be worried about work or what they want to get or the girlfriend they're looking for or whatever it is. I mean, it is inside you. I mean, the system, it gets inside the sinews and cells and marrow of your bones, right? Until wherever you go, you feel like you have to play it out, right? Until you shift it inside. And the earth is our ally. Otherwise, we don't have a reference point.
Yeah, that's it. I guess that's it too. The truing, right? And where does one resonate to that truing or that orientation? And that for me is the deep question, which I'm carrying with me. Also, as we close our recap here, grateful once again to Alixa Garcia for bringing her words, her poetry, her insights, and looking forward to the final official session of this series happening in a couple days here with Teocast and Ghost Horse.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that.
Please come if you're hearing this recap or you see it later. I have a very, very good feeling about this next one.
Beautiful cliffhanger. Okay. Well, onward. Thanks once again, brother.